Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very excited and very honored to bring the conversation I had with Robert Plomin. Robert is the MRC Research Professor in Behavioral Genetics at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience at King's College in London. He helped launch the Social, Genetic, and Developmental Psychiatry Research Centre, which brings together genetic and environmental strategies to understand individual differences in behavioral development. Since the mid-90s, he was part of the Twins Early Development Study, which has followed 10,000 pairs of UK twins from infancy through early adulthood and continues. He was the youngest elected president of the International Behavior Genetics Association and has received many Lifetime Research Achievement Awards. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, British Academy, American Academy of Political and Social Science, and the Academy of Medical Sciences in the United Kingdom. He is well published in the scientific literature with over 800 papers, and he is the author of the best-selling book, Blueprint: How DNA Makes Us Who We Are. We have a wide-ranging conversation within the world of behavioral genetics. We start by talking about why behavioral genetics has a lot of explanatory power for many things about us as humans. We talk about heritability, genetics and psychological research, SNPs, GWAS, and epigenetics. We also talk about shared and non-shared environments, twin models and adoption models, heritability and cognitive abilities, heritability and personality, psychopathology, and many other topics. Robert is a wonderfully kind man. He's very, very brilliant. He's committed his whole life to science and to doing great science. It really was a treat and a big honor to talk with him and learn from all of his years of experience. And he really was generous with his time, very gracious, very clear, and very kind in the conversation, and so giving of his research. And again, it was a big honor talking to Robert. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com, also on YouTube. So please subscribe to the Substack. That always helps. Share with your friends also helps. Contribute if you'd like. And now I bring you Robert Plomin. I am here with Robert Plomin, the one and only Robert Plomin. Robert, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I am very honored and very excited to talk with you.
My pleasure. I really enjoy your podcast.
Oh, thank you. Well, I enjoy your work, and we're going to talk all about it. So before we do, for listeners that don't know who you are, tell us a bit about who you are professionally, academically, and anything relevant at the moment.
Well, I won't go too far back in my history, but I grew up in Chicago, and then I went to graduate school at the University of Texas at Austin. And long story to that, I was an inner city kid where no one went to university, but I got a scholarship to go to Texas. But the amazing thing was they had the only program in behavioral genetics in the world. And so I took that as a graduate student, and it just floored me. I just knew right away that's what I wanted to do. And then why didn't 39 other graduate students in the class get into it? I really don't understand that. But that really turned me on to it. And then I went to Boulder, got a nice job at the only Institute for Behavioral Genetics in the world at the time. This was in mid-70s. And then I went to Penn State. And then I came to London, to King's College London, as an MRC Research Professor because my wife was English and I had brought her to America. And so they had a reverse brain drain program where they brought her back and I came along. And they were kind of sweet jobs. We had to sign contracts saying we wouldn't teach, we wouldn't do administration, all we would do is research, which wasn't too difficult to sign. So I helped Professor Sir Michael Rudder set up the first Medical Research Council Interdisciplinary Research Centre called, quite a big name, but Social, Genetic, and Developmental Psychiatry Centre. And the idea is to bring social, that is environmental and genetic factors together to study the development of behavior. And that's been going now since, we're on 30 years now. And it's gone very well and been exciting. I love being at these interdisciplinary research centers. I think a lot of synergy comes from that. So that's pretty much how I got to where I am.
What's it like living with 30, 40 years across the pond? Obviously, you're American. You lived and studied in America. But I mean, what's it like now for this part of your adult life, living so many decades in England for so many years?
It's great. I mean, my wife is British, so it was hard for her in America. Penn State is in the middle of Pennsylvania. It's not the University of Pennsylvania. Yeah. So it's quite rural and shotguns in the pickup trucks and that sort of thing. But it was a nice place to live. But we spent our summers and holidays in England, and I had more friends there. And, the ladder in England, the academic ladder is very steep. And the few people who survive at the top, they're really very, very bright. Whereas in America, it's a lot flatter. Anyone can become a professor, just about, because there's so many different places where you can become professors. So I think the other good thing about England, which is kind of anti-American in a way, is that it doesn't, in America, you have to fund geographically and by areas. It seems fair to do that. And if you have a huge amount of money, it works. But England knew it didn't have that much money, so they decided to focus on what they do well. And one of those things is definitely genetics. Most of the big genetic discoveries, including the genome sequencing project, were spearheaded by people in England. So it's been a great place to be because the funding is actually better by far in England, and especially now with the current situation, if you're in chosen areas, So that's been really great being here. And I still have colleagues and grants from America. So it's, you can have, I like the idea of science being international, I wish there were a scientific passport, that you didn't care what country you're in or from,
Yeah, I like that, actually. That's nice. Yeah. It's the way it should be. That's really, truly. So you mentioned this, you kind of got your teeth into behavioral genetics and you kind of stayed with it. Give us just kind of, we're just doing broad kind of a scope here. What's the powerful and wonderful thing about behavioral genetics that you would really want people to know, to say, look, there's a lot of, particular things. There's a lot of, debate, discussion about, certain areas, but what is it about behavioral genetics for you and what you've done in your research that you have seen that is so important and really illustrative for how we understand, humans? What is that? What is that kind of, bullseye of sorts of what makes it so important?
Great question. And it's probably best to go back to why I became interested in it. Yeah. I was a psychology undergraduate at DePaul University in Chicago, and I never read the word genetic in those days. Psychology in the early 70s was so environmentalistic. You could read in textbooks of the time that schizophrenia is caused by what your mother did to you in the first few years of life. Completely environmental. You are what you learn, basically. And so when I took this course in behavior genetics at Texas when I was a graduate student, it just mostly it was animal studies at that time, but they're very powerful because you can really control genetics and control the environment. And you realize what a big effect genetics has, in comparing inbred strains, but also in the proof of the pudding of selection. You can select mice for behavior, and it's very effective, as animal breeders have known for 10,000 years. So the power of it and the fact that I hadn't heard anything about it in psychology really appealed to me. And at the time, in the 70s, it was actually dangerous politically and professionally to talk about genetics. It was, it partly coming off of the Nazi Germany and eugenics, but more that I think psychology was so invested in the idea of environmentalism. Everything is determined by the environment. And during the 50 years I've been doing research in the field, one of the things that appeals to me the most is that I think we've made great progress in having people realize, take a more balanced view. It's not genetic, it's not deterministic, but a lot of who you are depends on your genetics. And that's what my book is called, Blueprint, How DNA Makes Us Who We Are, which is a bit of a tricky title, but we can go into that later. It's not deterministic, but it's a big part of understanding who we are. And then as you have kids, it's really important in terms of understanding your children and their development, something else that we can go into later. So I think the big change is that people really, I find like when I give public lectures, I don't get any blowback about genetics now. I haven't been called a Nazi for 20 years, probably. So I think that's been important. And then the DNA revolution coming along about 20 years ago has changed everything, because we're not talking abstractly about genetic influence. We're talking about these DNA sequence differences that you inherit. So it's been quite a ride. And the other thing I think we'll get into, and that appeals to me a lot, is that behavior genetics has told us more about the environment than a century of research from an environmentalistic perspective, because that perspective ignored genetics. And it's environmental influences in the family are completely confounded with genetics, because family members are 50% similar genetically. So perhaps we'll get into those things, but I've really been thrilled to see the general change in society towards a greater acceptance of genetic influence.
That's an interesting context that you give, because what you're describing when you first came on to things in the early 70s, I mean, in some circles sounds a lot like today as well. People have done this sort of regression back to, it's all environment, or genes don't make a difference, or it's not deterministic and all these things. And I don't think anyone's arguing with that, but to underplay the role of genetics is, I think a disservice for understanding who we are. But it is interesting to hear how these things sort of have a rhythm to them throughout time. You have people that, go, very, very, on one sense, you have our previous history with eugenics, of course. But I feel like people see that as always this shadow that looms over. And I don't really personally, I mean, it's important to know history, but I don't see it that way. And I think it's again, a disservice where people try to write off the power of genetics or understanding behavior with genetics as if it's an either or, when it's really a both and. And I think that's what you say in your book, and I think that's what you said in your research. So, I think it's important for people to understand that, these things are essential. And again, there's some things that you can know. This is kind of going to your point about animal studies. And there's other things that are going to be more fuzzy. And, that's why you do good research and things like that. So it's interesting, though, hearing you say in the beginning, it sort of sounds like in some circles how it is today. But it was a lot of, behaviorism, the environment, 60s, 70s, and then we went back to genetics, and then it kind of regressed back to, well, it's just all environment and your social construct and all these things. So it's very interesting seeing those those things kind of flipping, back and forth over decades. I don't know if it seems that way to you, but you can kind of see some of that kind of rhythm now.
Well, I don't know. I definitely in the 70s, there was psychology was environmentalistic, full stop.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, there's some ups and downs, but in general, I see there's been a real progression towards acceptance of genetics, a balanced view. Like, you don't want the pendulum to swing all the way back to nature, but I think it's been an important development. And as I say, when I give talks, I find very little pushback. People, if you scratch the surface of what they know about genetics, it's not very much, but they're open to it. They all remember Uncle Harry, who had this reading problem, or, and so I think I've been more, I accept that there are some ups and downs, but in general, what I see over these 50 years that I've been in the field is pretty much of a continuous trend towards public acceptance of genetics.
I do agree with that more on the public side in terms of, you'll still hear people colloquially say, oh, well, that just must be a genetic thing, or that comes in my family, so that's somewhere in the genetics. You'll hear people say these types of things, kind of to your point about, so-and-so has a reading disorder, or somebody has, they have bad cholesterol. I must have got it somewhere in my genetics or something like that. So yeah. So a big concept here, which is important to get into. Of course, you've written and talked about it, but is heritability. Also, really, really important. What is it? How do we see the essential features for humans? And I guess sort of how do we look at the interplay of what's inheritable and what that interaction is like in the environment, if any? Tell us about heritability.
Well, heritability is probably the most misunderstood 6-syllable word in biology. People think it's a statistic it's a descriptive statistic, like a mean and a variance. It describes variation in a particular population at a particular time. And so it describes what is. It doesn't tell us about what could be. And that's an important distinction. It also deals with the normal range of variation. We can only study the people we can study. And although these samples are quite representative, maybe of 95% of the population, parents who abuse their kids probably don't participate in research very much. And similarly, we don't deal with rare single gene mutations, which can have sledgehammer effects as well. But it's a lot to know about 95% of the population and what causes differences in those populations. And for a century, psychologists have assumed it's the environment, which is a reasonable hypothesis. Why does your child have reading disability? Well, it must have something to do with not being exposed to language sufficiently. Why is the kid schizophrenic? And it's because it's hard to believe now, but I mean, it really was in the textbooks at the time that it's mother blaming. It's what your mother did to you in the first few years of life, which is about as wicked as anything could be, because you don't find out your kid's schizophrenic until they're in their late teens or 20s, at which time you can't do much about what happened to them in the first few years of life. So it's important that we talk about normal variation, and we're talking about what makes people different. That's another thing that people really get wrong here. You and I, everybody shares maybe 99.9% of the 6 billion base pairs of DNA in our genome. That's what makes us human. But that 0.1% of the DNA, which if you have 6 billion base pairs is still many millions of DNA, those differences are what we're talking about when we say there's genetic influence, heritability on a trait. So heritability is a statistic that describes the extent to which variation in a particular population on a trait can be ascribed to genetic differences. And by genetic, we mean inherited DNA sequence differences. And so the third thing I'd like to just that people often get wrong is we're talking about probabilistic propensities. People learn about genetics from Mendel. Mendel studied single gene mutations in pea plants. And there are maybe, some people say, 7,000 single gene mutations in humans, but they're very rare. They're devastating often for the people who have them, but they don't actually contribute much to variation in the population for common disorders like psychopathology or complex traits like cognitive abilities or school performance. So that's another, I think, very important distinction that what we've learned from molecular genetics, and we've always known in quantitative genetics from animal studies, is that we're not talking about single gene mutations. We're talking about genetic influence from thousands of tiny DNA differences. That's called polygenic. And behavior is considered to be the most extreme polygenic traits around. There's so many different genes that affect it. What's important about that is it shifts from determinism, hardwired determinism, to probabilistic propensities. Because for a single gene mutation, like if you had the dominant mutation at the tip of chromosome 4 for Huntington's disease, you will die from Huntington's. It doesn't matter what your diet is, how you exercise, you will die from it unless something else kills you first. And that's the way we think about single gene mutations. And we get that from Mendel. And that's the way genes work, the way Mendel described the laws of heredity. But now Fisher said, as in the foundational paper in 1918 of quantitative genetics, that it's not either or. Mendel was right in the way he described hereditary mechanism, processes. But all you got to do is consider having several genes, and you quickly go from that deterministic position to a probabilistic one. It's quantitative rather than qualitative. And now from the DNA revolution, we know we're not just talking about dozens, we're talking about thousands of genes of incredibly small effect. So the big advance is we can put those small effects together and create a score called a polygenic score that predicts behavior. But the third point I'm making here is that we're not talking about deterministic, hardwired, single gene effects, but we're talking about the probabilistic effect, the influence of many, many genes of small effect. It's hard to get your head around a bit, but it's a critical point for understanding what heritability is.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously complex. I mean, I guess you're talking about heritability with an individual, right? We'll come on to groups and things like that with people because that gets really complicated of sorts. But I mean, the common thing that people take is height or eye color. Even something as basic as, I'm, 5'9", I'm the average, right? There's a bunch of factors that are at play there, but I don't have one gene for height. I have thousands that are implicated in height, even eye color, same thing. How is it that with one individual, in one sense, multicellular organism, you can have one trait that has multiple genes involved, but even something as simple as height, because once you reach your height, you kind of more or less stay there for most of your life until you get older or whatever. But once you start branching outward with cognitive abilities, behavior, temperament, things like that, it becomes really, really complicated. I guess how does heritability work on something as simple as height or eye color, and then something as more complex as behavior or personality in one individual?
Well, I think some people would disagree that height is simple. Yes. Eye color certainly isn't simple. We used to think of it like a single gene trait. We know it isn't. But, the neat thing about height is most people accept that height is highly heritable. It might be 80, 90% heritable. Now, what that means is of the differences we see in height between individuals in a population, 90% of those differences, the variance, is due to inherited DNA differences. That doesn't mean your 5'9" came 80% from your genes and 20% from your environment. It doesn't translate to one individual. Your height might be largely determined by maybe diseases early in life or nutritional problems. It might be more environmental than average in the population. So it's an average of differences, of the causes of differences in a population. It doesn't apply to one individual. So, but your best guess for one individual, just like the mean of the population doesn't apply to a lot of people. But if you had to guess about somebody, you'd guess the average because that's where most of the people are due to the bell curve. So height isn't simple, but the neat thing about it is that we've done surveys where people do accept that there's a very strong genetic influence for height. But now when you get to traits like weight, people don't think it's very heritable. Because, they think of willpower and, if you don't eat, you lose weight. But that misses the point, though, that there are these genetic propensities. And my polygenic score for weight is my highest risk score. I'm at the 94th percentile genetically for weight. And so I really appreciate that because I've had a lifelong battle of the bulge. I've always been dieting, and until Ozempic and those drugs came along, it was a real battle. And that's another good example. It turns out it is highly heritable, maybe 60, 70% heritable, which some people find very surprising, that weight, body mass index, is so highly heritable. And yet, Ozempic and these other drugs it brought my weight down from 250 pounds down to 220 pounds. And so that's an environmental intervention for a trait that's substantially heritable. And the difference is that Ozempic didn't cause environmental differences in the population. So when you do these studies, now it may be now that I would predict, given how many people are using these drugs, that it may be that there's less genetic influence because there's more environmental variation. Only wealthy people can afford to get Ozempic, So I think then when you turn to cognitive abilities and other psychological traits, it doesn't seem to me so surprising that if you think of the brain and its complexity, that we're not talking about simple single gene pathways. We're talking about multiple genetic effects across many parts of the brain. And they add up to create genetic variation between people. Again, in this probabilistic way. It's not hardwired or deterministic at all. So to the point of your question, though, one of the major findings from behavioral genetics is we've gone from thinking nothing's heritable in the 1970s in psychology to realizing everything is heritable. You can't find any trait in psychology reliably measured that does not show significant genetic influence in an adequately powered study. So that's quite an amazing transformation.
Well, yes, 100%. Because I mean, as a psychologist, I find much of psychology today, very wanting in research and science. And there's good people that are doing, good science out there. But I think that statement you made is critical, right? I mean, that's something that can really help for the field, for psychology and maybe other adjacent fields. I don't know about sociology or things like that, but to say like this has good standing. This isn't just bunk science or anything like that. Like this has something like really, really tangible with it.
Yeah, and that's what appeals to me about this field. Philosophers of science have talked about progressive research fields where you build. I mean, you think that's the way science always works. You build on previous findings. You find problems. Like people say, oh, there's these problems with the twin method. So you say, well, maybe let's examine it. And we've got these different methods, like the adoption method, completely different method, completely different assumptions, and yet the conclusions are the same. And then DNA comes along and you say, well, if what we've been saying is true, we ought to be able to find the DNA differences, and we do. So it's that progressive part of behavioral genetics is what I like a lot. And a lot of psychology isn't like that. It seems to me a lot of psychology is faddish. You go after one fad, you don't solve the problem. People get bored with it, and then they go on and do another thing. So I think that is very important. And it's why I think, unlike the other problem with many psychology and all of science, is the replication crisis. I'm sure you've talked about that at some point in your podcast.
Many times.
Yeah. And behavior genetics, I wrote a paper called, 10 replicated findings from behavioral genetics, because it is this progressive science. And because it's had so much controversy, there's a higher standard of proof, for genetic influence, I think. And as a result, it made us less prone to the replication crisis for reasons we could get into. So I think those, and also to your point, I would say that probably, I'm sure there's much greater funding for genetic research than other areas of psychology per capita. Papers are published in the best journals as well. So this isn't, as you said, bunk science. I mean, this is, you have to go pretty far to find people who are willing to say, oh no, there's nothing to this genetics in science. I still get that a bit in education because I work in educational achievement and cognitive ability. I still find in academic education circles, you do find resistance still, but that's a real backwater of research, and I don't know that they really accept empirical science. A lot of that so-called research is demonstration projects. You've got some pet idea, and you just do a little study that shows that what you believed is true. So and this is sort of related to what you said before about public acceptance. I find really complete public acceptance. The only flack you get is, I think, from academics, because you can't find a teacher who teaches in front of 30 kids who doesn't recognize that there are some inherent differences. Now, they might think it's from the family or whatever, but I don't have trouble talking to teachers about it. They get it, you know? It doesn't mean you give up on those kids who have trouble, but you've got to recognize some kids have more trouble learning certain things, like learning to read, for example. So I do think it is important, and if anyone in your audience needs convincing, I hope they'd give my book a go, Blueprint, because that was the main reason I wrote it, is to give people an appreciation for the importance of genetics.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think it is a bit frustrating. I mean, look, I think it's important to have, good critiques of things or whatever, but I think a lot of the times in academia, it becomes very insular and circular in some ways, and it becomes, everyone's just kind of, talking with themselves and not getting out there. Now, again, there are good people that don't do that, but, it is frustrating to feel, that there's always having to be an explaining of why genetics still matters, or you're not a Nazi or a eugenicist. I mean, even I feel that. I'm not in this research, but I feel like, I have to make sure I explain that it's also environment and social, which is it's frustrating, because it's like if something has good, there's a big replication crisis. You're right. I've talked about it here a bunch of times, and we have one area where we know that these things replicate. It would make sense to kind of plant your flag there and say, we know this stuff. We know a few things here, and let's start from there and then see how we can, find other things. So I totally hear you on that.
Yeah.
Let me ask about this difference here, since we were talking about heritability, about genetic variance versus genetic shift. Can you talk about this distinction here, about how this works?
Well, we don't see the phrase genetic shift very much. I think by that you mean like a mutational shift in an evolutionary sense. And
usually in population genetics, you might see this kind of thing, go across populations.
Yeah, but because we're dealing with these highly polygenic traits, it doesn't really matter very much. We're talking about DNA variation, and most of the DNA revolution has been based on one type of DNA variant, the most common type, called a single nucleotide polymorphism. So that's there's a 4-letter alphabet, A, C, T's, and G's, and those are the steps of the spiral staircase. And a SNP, a single nucleotide polymorphism, is a change in those A, C, T's, and G's at one step in the spiral staircase of DNA. And there are maybe 10 million in the human population, but any given ancestral group, you or I will probably have 4 million. It sort of depends how you define it, because we also have a lot of de novo mutations. But, we've got millions of these, despite the fact that we're 99.9% similar genetically. So these are the most common DNA variants, and they facilitate a technology that led to the DNA revolution called the SNP chip. So in the 90s, we had a replication crisis in genetics or genomics, because people could only study a small number of DNA variants in rather small groups, numbers of people, because it was so expensive to do the genotyping for each SNP or DNA variant individually for each person. So as a result, we were set up for all the errors of the replication crisis. Samples too small to find effects unless they were huge, and we now know that they weren't. They were extremely tiny. And so there were thousands of studies published across the life sciences in the 90s called candidate gene studies, where you say, you're interested in depression, so what genes would you study? Well, maybe serotonin or serotonin transporter. And so you get a couple variants in those in a small study, and by chance you're going to get some positive results, and people publish those. But they didn't replicate. They totally didn't replicate. So, nowadays you just couldn't publish a candidate gene study unless you replicated it in other samples and showed that you had power to detect the effect sizes that are expected, which are incredibly tiny effect sizes, which means you need huge samples to do that.
Yeah.
So a neat study came out in about 2011 or so, saying, taking the 12 candidate genes that were reported most often for cognitive abilities, and they tried to replicate in 3 large studies. Not a single one replicated, so that was kind of proof that the candidate gene approach didn't work. But then by 2000, the SNP chip came along, and that was an array the size of a postage stamp that could genotype hundreds of thousands of SNPs efficiently. And at first, they were about $10,000 per chip, which you can only use once for an individual. But now they've gone down to less than 100. You could actually, the real costs are maybe 30 or 50 pounds. So that what they consist of are probes. Well, I won't get into the technology of it, but it made it a game changer because anybody could do it. The costs were so low that you could then study large samples. And once you genotype somebody on a SNP chip, just using saliva, for example, and getting some cells from saliva, that's what 23andMe do and Ancestry.com. They're using these SNP chips. That's the end of. That's all you got to do, because then you've got the genotypes that you could then use to study any trait, like psychopathology or cognitive abilities or height and weight. So the SNP chip it was a technological advance that made the DNA revolution happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously very powerful, and they're telling us a lot about our traits. I'm curious about also something that you mentioned in your book and research is the GWAS studies. Now, I've talked to a few people about this, and I think they're great. I think they can. There's a lot of potential there, but some people say, well, we don't know what it really tells us, so why do them, or things like that, which is strange to me, I guess. But at the current moment, closer to middle of 2025. Where are we on GWAS studies, genome-wide association studies? And what's their utility and their power, how they're improving, and what can they really tell us, and where are we going with it? How is this a good method, if you think it is?
Yeah. Well, it was sort of the dream in the 90s that you might be able to, instead of taking a candidate gene approach where you decide theoretically what ought to be related, which we now know has very little to do with what is actually related genetically to a trait. If you could somehow study DNA markers across the whole genome, and that would move it to an atheoretical approach where you just say, let's look across the whole genome, let's look at hundreds of thousands of DNA differences across the genome, and just see empirically which of those, if any, relate to a trait. And so that was the real revolution of the genome-wide association study that was facilitated by SNP chips. And it has been a brilliant approach. I don't know who these people are who say it's not worthwhile, because there are probably 10,000 such studies now across the life sciences, medicine, biology, everything is using it. Going out into the wild for ecology, you can do a quick genome scan and determine which species it is. Or, we say revolutionized too much, but boy, that really has revolutionized all the life sciences. So I don't get it when people say, oh, well, what's the big deal here? Well, it's a huge deal, because in my area, we can, GWAS studies of cognitive ability, we can now predict. In the UK, we have these standardized educational tests that kids take at the end of high school, 16 years of age. We can now predict 20% of the variance of how kids do on GCSE scores. And people say, well, that's only 20%. That's a long way from 100%. Well, these tests are 60% heritable, so we'll never explain 100% because they're only 60% heritable. Now, 20% of 60% is a third of the genetic variance that we can predict with measured DNA differences. I mean, how can you argue with DNA differences? You can say, well, the twin method has these problems, the adoption method has those problems. But how do you argue with DNA, where I know nothing about a kid except what we get off of this SNP chip, and we can predict 20% of the variance? The other part of that I'd like to say is people dismiss, well, just 20%. Name me anything in psychology that explains 20% of the variance. Like a good example, a good example in England, in a contrast to the 20% we can explain of GCSE scores, these standardized tests. People in England, wealthier people send their kids to private schools. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars to send your kids to a private school. And there are these government, they're not a government agency, they're independent of the government, that do these evaluations of schools, the best in the world. I mean, they go to schools for 2 or 3 days. They interview the janitors, the students, the kids, the parents, the teachers. You couldn't get a better estimate of the quality of a school, including observing classrooms and all of that. So these are great ratings of schools called Ofsted school ratings. And they create league tables where parents, look at which schools have the best Ofsted school ratings. And sometimes parents will spend a lot of money to move across the street so they're in the catchment area of a better school. Okay, so people accept those as important. It changes lives. How much variance in the GCSE scores is explained by school quality ratings of Ofsted? And the answer is 4%. And if you correct for SES, socioeconomic status, because kids aren't randomly assigned to these areas, it's 1%.
Wow.
So people make a huge deal about it, 1% of the variance. It's a significant effect, but people don't get effect size. You can't just say it's a significant finding. I hope people always say, yeah, but how big an effect is it?
Right.
we have thousands of studies on sex differences, say in cognitive development. Girls are better at verbal and boys are better at math. And that explains 1% of the variance. So if you draw the normal curve of boys and the normal curve of girls, you need a very fine pen to show the difference because they overlap almost entirely. In other words, if all you know about a kid is if they're a boy or a girl, you don't know anything about their verbal ability or math ability because the effect is significant, but the effect size is trivial. It's not socially significant, although it might be statistically significant, which is just a function of sample size. And in those studies, you've got tens of thousands of kids. So a tiny, tiny difference can be highly statistically significant, but has no social significance. So in that context, I think these genetic findings are very powerful. And that's why they've completely taken over in medicine. The NHS, the National Health Service in England, has a £80 million project now to trial that. And Finland and Estonia have been doing it for a decade. If you went into the hospital, they collect blood. They said, would you like us to do DNA testing? And we're only going to tell you actionable things, like if you have a severe risk of, say, heart attack, for example. And, so I think it really is going to change medicine, and then I think psychology will come along after that. Because the same information that you would get, that SNP chip, would tell you about psychological traits just as much as medical traits. And more than that now, the big change now is going to whole genome sequencing. So instead of looking at a few hundred, say 600,000 typically DNA differences across the genome, that is across the 23 pairs of chromosomes, now for probably less than $400, $300, you can do the whole genome sequence. You can get all 6 billion base pairs of DNA. Wow. And that's all she wrote in terms of genetics. That's all you inherit. So that's going to be the next, it's happening already, the next big thing. The UK has a project called Our Future Health, which is getting 5 million people. And the UK Biobank has had 500,000 people. And it's been amazing. Its data are open to anybody to do research.
Wow.
And they have genome data and cognitive data and all the NHS health records. That's a great thing in England, is you can get at electronic health records, which is hard to do in the States because it's so much state controlled. So people say, oh, well, this is no big deal. This is a huge deal. It's going to change people's lives.
Yeah, that's what you're kind of getting to it there. I mean, where's the future of this going, right? So we have the GWAS studies, and you talked about the SNPs and things like that. We can bring in the polygenic index here as well, the PGIs or, scores. And so people have talked about this, but I mean, in your mind, what's like the next thing in the next 2 years, 5, 10 years? What are you seeing is happening here with a lot of these tools and methods that's really, incredible? I mean, the one thing that you're mentioning here is the full, the 6 billion or whatever it is. But what else are you seeing? Medicine is using it. Psychology will, come afterwards like it usually does. But what do you see as some other kind of innovations that are happening here with these tools?
Well, the reason medicine's so interested in moving in this direction is because there's a general shift towards preventing disease rather than waiting for disease to occur and then trying to fix it, because we're not very good at that,
No, we're not.
If you have a massive heart attack, it supposedly costs $500,000, let alone, the quality of life is diminished after that. So if you can just prevent some of these diseases from happening, it's so much better, economically, socially, and personally. And that's, I think, the way we need to go in terms of psychology as well. We're not very good at dealing with obesity once someone's obese, or alcoholism. It's very tricky. Or schizophrenia, people even say. If you can ameliorate the first onset of schizophrenia, has a better prognosis as well. So for me, it's the prevention. And there's no better early warning system than DNA. Just to make sure people understand that you start life as a single cell, and the DNA, combination of your mother's egg and your father's sperm, each one contributing one of each pair of chromosomes. And that DNA is the same DNA in the trillions of cells in your body. And which I think is remarkable, that the signal from that one cell can filter out. It's, it's not surprising that heritability, even for height, is only 80%. It's amazing that it can be so high when it has to work itself through all of these complex developmental biological systems. I think its fidelity is amazing from that point of view. So I think that means that DNA at birth or at conception is just as good at predicting height, weight, reading disability, schizophrenia, as it would be in adulthood. And there's nothing else that's as good as a predictor, because, if you wanted to predict how well a kid does at school, if you give them tests when they go to school, that will predict at least as well. Like in first grade, it will predict GCSE scores, not as well as DNA, but pretty well. But the neat thing here is you can predict from very early in life. So, for example, if you could predict reading disability, almost all kids with reading disability at school have language problems earlier. Yep. And there are good intervention programs for language. The problem being that people say, well, why don't you just do that? Well, good interventions need to be early, and they need to be extensive. None of these little gimmicks, like growth mindset or grit, that's not going to do it,
right.
And so I think if you can identify kids who are likely to have these problems and you intervene with something like language, it can't hurt the kid. And, I think there's enough evidence to suggest that it would at least ameliorate the problems when kids get to school, as opposed to what we do now. Wait till a kid gets to school, have them fail, and, it's like Humpty Dumpty falls off the wall. Even if you can fix their reading, they're still considered the dummies, because they couldn't read. So I do think the medical notion of shifting from waiting until disease occurs to preventing has to be the way to go. And that's why I'm most excited about the potential of polygenic scores to predict psychological traits.
I really like that you mentioned this and bring this up, because that's something I also feel very strongly about. Is I think anybody that works clinically or has worked clinically will be able to say, like, oh, we can see in this person where it went wrong, or where something happened, or or in some cases, there's a genetic component here. If you catch it early, that this if this would have been caught when they were in first grade or third grade, instead of trying to catch it now in 11th grade or in college, this could have been much different for somebody, right? Mm-hmm. And I see the power of that, and I think that's what everybody wants, right? You want proactive, preventative care, not something that's reactive and trying to say, well, how do we fix a crooked line now? And it's like, and I'm not trying to say that people are crooked lines, but I'm not trying to say that. But I'm saying is, like, people, you're right. I mean, there's the cost, aspect of it or whatever, but for people's quality of life, people say, if someone had just told me this, and I'll say this, I totally agree with you. I think a lot of the gimmicks, I'll just say, in psychology are terribly frustrating. I mean, I think maybe there's some good faith people out there that are trying their best, But again, I think this is where I think the embrace of what behavioral genetics can do for preventative care within mental health generally, within behavior, with all these things, I think is very, very, very important. Let me ask briefly about epigenetics. This is another term that gets thrown around. I mean, what are your thoughts on it? I mean, I don't know what to think about it. I mean, I'm not closely in this field. I mean, again, I've heard different things on this. Some people absolutely love it. Some people are very, very questionable on it. Is it too trendy, or what is there other things we know about it? What's your view on epigenetics at the moment?
Well, epigenetics is an important phenomenon biologically. It's a type of slow motion gene expression. So you have the same DNA in all the cells of your body, but clearly the genes in your liver are translated and transcribed into different proteins. Yep. Different genes are active in your liver than in your brain. Now, maybe 70-80% of all genes are active in the brain, but in the liver or other organs, there's a different set of genes that are expressed. So genes can't do anything unless they're expressed. And they're not expressed unless they're in the environment. You put DNA on the table, it doesn't do anything. It evolved in a particular environment. Mm-hmm. So that's where people mix it up a bit. And originally, I think people liked epigenetics because it means above genetics. Anything that's anti-Mendelian, certain people will like, Yeah. But it's not that at all. It's just a type of slow motion gene expression. Because as you and I are talking, we're transcribing genes in our brain at a very fast rate. And so that involves RNA. And RNA evolved to be responsive to the environment. Mm-hmm. Whereas DNA was meant to be faithful to the ancestral heritage of our normally expected environment. So epigenetics is important, but people got into the idea that there's transgenerational influence, that you inherit epigenetic marks from your mother. And I think that's pretty well debunked now. There's people talk about some animal studies. They're not very clear. There might be a gene or two that escapes the processes that erase these marks, because that isn't what gene expression is about. Gene expression is about being responsive to your current environment. DNA handles the ancestral what would you call it? Stability, I suppose. So I basically, it's the first question I get in a public audience. Yeah, but what about epigenetics? In the sense that, well, it's not really, genetics isn't all that important, it's epigenetics. Well, epigenetics is an important process of gene expression, but it is not inherited. What's inherited is DNA sequence variation, full stop.
Yeah, that's important. This is what's frustrating about this stuff, right? Is something becomes, for whatever reason, popular. It agrees with people's Bayesian priors or whatever it is, and then it's off to the races with it, and it becomes watered down. And then you get the popular books, and it gets sold, and you get people doing. And it's hard to say, well, actually, no, this is a little bit too. And this is what's frustrating about this stuff. I mean, it's very. And again, there's something that happens when it gets, filtered out, where it's good science and then trying to communicate it. And somehow people think you have to, take out all the good parts of it and just water it down so people can understand it. And I think, again, your book Blueprint does a really nice job of explaining it very easily. And other people have done work on this. I do want to ask about other things that are very interesting. I really like your whole bit on psychopathology and psychiatry, and I'm curious about obviously achievement and things like that. So before we get there, because those things I want to spend some time on. Why do you think some people, and maybe this is really just in academia, so I don't want to make this too academic, right? But why do you think people have strong criticisms about maybe your work or other people's work on heritability? Do you, for you, I mean, you're a good scientist, of course. How do you see, you can say, look, I could see some limits here. I can see where this, yes, there's some things we got to know or whatever, but let's not forget all the really wonderful things. Why do you think people overemphasize that? And we can bring in here this idea of a shared environment, what the impact of the environment is. I feel maybe some people, I don't think you do this, but I think some people, sure, they minimize or they downplay the environment and they just focus on genetics overwhelmingly. I don't think you do that, but it's, even if someone is saying, look, here's the genetic piece, here's what's heritable. Yes, there's interaction with the environment. Even if there is interaction, this would still be the case. I feel like people just like turn their brain off when they hear someone say that. And there's just like, well, this person is acknowledging this. You're not listening to what they're saying. How do you have, like, what's your kind of response for these types of things of like, yeah, this is my research, this is the research what it says, but it's not an either or thing. How do you engage with this fruitfully?
Well, long ago, I decided that I wouldn't respond to criticisms unless people were serious about scientists, because it's so easy to say, well, okay, maybe identical twins are treated more similarly than fraternal twins. That's the twin method, comparing, genetically identical twins to fraternal twins who are 50% similar genetically. And so we say, okay, yeah, we can study that, and that was studied for a while. But then people are on, yeah, but what about, what aboutism? And they're not interested in doing research. They're just interested in making it difficult for research to get accepted. Mm-hmm. And so I decided, I wouldn't really respond to that. I'd keep my head down, I'd do the studies, and hope that in the end, psychology would be an empirical-based science where data rules, full stop. Mm-hmm. And if someone's got data that conflicts, okay, you got to deal with that. But someone has an opinion about something, that's their opinion, fine, they can have it, doesn't matter to me. Mm. In the 70s and 80s, there was some question as to whether psychology would be an empirical science. I mean, sociology for a long time wasn't an empirical science. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I think that's been vindicated if you take a long view on it, that you're better off just doing the research. And I think there's such a mountain of data now from twin studies, family studies, adoption studies, and now DNA studies, that very few serious scientists will object to the statement that everything is significantly heritable. Sure. But now the other side of it, though, that we haven't talked about is I believe that genetic research has provided the best evidence we have for the importance of the environment. Mm. And the reason for that is environmental studies ignored genetics, and they're completely confounded. Mm. So, you can't say mothers do this, and therefore kids have these outcomes because they share genes. And, if you just assume it's all environmental, you go badly wrong. And it has gone badly wrong in the sense that what runs in families is DNA. What makes kids in a family similar is DNA. It's not their shared family environment. Yet heritability on average for psychological traits is 50%, going from about 40% to personality to about 60% to cognitive abilities. But that means that the other 50% is not genetic. That is, it's not due to inherited DNA differences. So you'd say, well, that's the environment. But it's important to realize it's just what that is not genetic. And by environment, people immediately think of nurture because of nature, nurture. And nurture implies, reasonably enough, parental influences, family influences. But what runs in families is DNA. The environment's important, but it's not making kids in a family similar. And I can go into the adoption and twin data behind that. But the important finding is that the environment works very differently from the way we assumed it worked, from Freud onwards. It's not due to these shared family influences of having the same parents, growing up in the same family, neighborhood, school, friends, etc. Whatever it is, the environment is making two kids growing up in the same family different from one another. That is no more similar than kids raised in different families. And that's a mind-boggling finding. So that's called non-shared environment. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot to say about that, but I wrote a paper recently that said after 30 years, we haven't had much success in identifying what those non-shared environmental influences are. And so the paper I published last year is called Non-Shared Environment, Real but Random. I've come to conclude that the way the environment works is not systematic. It's maybe idiosyncratic or stochastic. And I'm really into the idea of stochasticity, the idea that in all complex biological systems, DNA does a great job trying to come through the complexity of development and biological systems, but it's not perfect. And there's noise all the way along the system. And then when you think about psychological systems, there's probably even more room for noise. And this is like unpredictability is what I'm talking about here. Something causes it, but it might be so idiosyncratic that we'll never be able to identify it and use it to predict. So Thomas Eagle, this famous philosopher of science in 2005, has a paper called Randomness is Unpredictability. He's just defining it as unpredictability. And this I don't know if you haven't had Sapolsky on, have you?
I haven't, no. I haven't.
You know his book last year called Determined. It's just the opposite of this. Because what I'm saying is that really the way the environment works is in a non-deterministic, in the sense of unpredictable way. And Sapolsky's saying everything's determined, and it is retrospectively. You know, if I lift my finger, you could trace everything neurally back to the brain, and you can show that before I actually lifted my finger, there was something in my brain that changed. You know, so you can trace it all the way, but you can't predict when I'm going to do that again. And so that for me, I mean, this gets into very deep rabbit holes of, you know, what's real and that sort of thing. But I do think it's very important to consider the possibility that what we're talking about with the environment, far from Freudian simplistic systems of mother blaming, might actually be these very idiosyncratic, stochastic-like mini experiences that we can never maybe get a handle on to be able to predict.
Well, one thing I'll say is, again, I'm biased here, but one of the things that I get frustrated, both internally and externally, you know, is the attacks on psychology. Some of them are totally valid, and I've beaten up my field many times, publicly and privately, because of where it's at the moment, which is frustrating. But it is important that it is a science. It is important that it is rooted in, I mean, the things that, for me, for psychology that I learn from now are from, you know, cognitive neuroscience or cognitive studies and from genetics. And that's where psychology reigns at the moment, or that intersection between those two disciplines. And for me, psychologists have to, you know, catch up to that, or they have to get with the program on that. Anything outside of that, not incorporating that, is just not going to hold in a lot of ways. We see, you know, you can have theory, and theory is good, and theory is important. You can have hypotheses; those are good. But just having that, or just doing activist work, is not going to get you anywhere. It's just not going to get you anywhere very far, and it is deeply troubling, because you are perpetuating a field to become less scientific with those types of things, and that's a deep concern that I have. So I
agree completely. You know, from the start, I've always thought you just got to hope that psychology remains an empirical science. You know, so I agree. I think that really needs to be emphasized, what you just said about that.
Well, because, and so this kind of goes to the point, you know, kind of where I, you know, kind of, you know, pull out all the hair I have remaining, which isn't any, but is this overemphasis on a shared environment, or those are social constructs, or these are environmental causes, or it's like, but again, it's like, but how do you know that? And even if it is, you have organisms that have DNA that's heritable, that's interacting with the environment. So how can you cannot just rely on that because it agrees with a prior that you like. You can't just do that. It's not responsible. And so this is where I think it becomes important. It's like this idea of shared environment and what that looks like. Tell me though, since we mentioned it, and I'm just curious, because again, some people have these poking holes and things and stuff, but twin models, adoption models, why? I mean, you can briefly just explain what it is as a reminder for people, but we've used that a lot. We've used that for a while. I mean, definitely since the 90s and before that and into present. But I mean, why have we used twin models and adoption models? What are their biggest strengths, and where do you see, maybe there's some limitations, but how do using those there's the animal models, the twin models, but then now we connect this with some of the things we were talking about earlier with, the GWAS and the polygenic scores and all that. How are we seeing a kind of fusion of these things coming together to really help give a robust kind of understanding of, things like heritability?
Yeah. Well, the first twin studies were done exactly a century ago on cognitive abilities, actually. And it was an attempt to do something empirical with human behavior. Now, with animal studies, you can do selection, which is kind of the proof of the pudding. If something's heritable, you ought to be able to select for it, and you can. But with humans, what do? Well, before the DNA revolution, it was a remarkable, it's like a biological gift experiment, where you've got these two types of twins. And that was first realized in the late 1800s and was really nailed down in the early 1900s. So you've got twins, 1% of all births are twins, and it turns out that about a third of those are identical twins. So they're like clones. They come from a single fertilized egg that splits in the first few days of life. So even with DNA sequencing, they have exactly the same DNA. They grow up in the same womb in the same family. But in contrast, 2/3 of twins are non-identical or fraternal twins, which, like any brother and sister, are separately fertilized eggs, so that they're 50% similar genetically. So there's a lot of control there. They're both raised in the same womb at the same time. They grow up in the same family. They're the same age. And because 2/3 are fraternal twins, half of them are same-sex, half are opposite sex. Identical twins, of course, are always same-sex. So a better experiment is to take the 1/3 that are the same sex, which you can compare. So there's a lot of control there, and the massive experimental manipulation. Well, it's not a manipulation, but the turning point of the method is to say if a trait is heritable, you have to predict that the identical twin pairs will pair by pair be more similar than the fraternal twins because they're twice as similar genetically. So it's an amazing, neat, sort of biological quasi-experiment. And the results kind of make sense. Height is highly heritable, and weight is less heritable. Physiological characteristics are on average 70% heritable. So it was the data seemed to be reasonable and suggesting a lot of genetic influence. But it has problems, like the main one being the equal environments assumption. Maybe identical twins are treated more similarly than non-identical twins. Well, it's not going to make them more similar in height, you'd think, but, maybe for psychological characteristics. But you can study that. There were a half a dozen neat studies where obstetricians, it's kind of neat. If you have friends who are twins, I just met this pair of identical twins the pair of twins at a restaurant. They were waiters at this restaurant. And, I know with one question, you can find out if twins are identical or not. You can ask, when you were young, did people have trouble telling you apart? And the reason that's like 95% accurate in predicting zygosity because it encompasses hair color, size, so many physical characteristics. Well, but these guys said, oh no, we're fraternal twins. And I said, they were identical. I mean, I would bet my house they were identical. But then you ask why? And the answer always is because the obstetrician at birth looked at the mess of the placenta and said, there was one placenta, so they must be identical twins. What the obstetrician says at birth about zygosity is no better than flipping a coin. So as a result, you get a lot of pairs like this who think they're fraternal, whose parents think they're fraternal, but they're actually identical. And so is it their assumed mistaken zygosity or their true zygosity that determines their similarity? It's their true zygosity. So there's neat experiments like that you can do, but they all take time. But, I think nobody's interested in doing that anymore because there's been so much research along those lines that the assumption seems to be reasonable. But the neat thing is we've got this other experiment, which is a social experiment called adoption, where if you take kids who are adopted away at birth from their birth parents and raised in an adoptive family, they're still 50% genetically related to their birth parent, whom they never saw after the first week of life. but yet they're reared from the first few weeks of life with their adoptive parents. And so if it's nurture, you'd think adoptive parents will be just as similar to their adopted kids as parents. There's no good word for, you don't want to say normal parents, but parents who share genes and environment with their kid. And so take weight, for example, parents and offspring, when the offspring are at least in adolescence, correlate maybe 0.4 for weight. And for a century, people assume that's environmental. That's nurture, right? Because you grow up with these parents and they give you your food and lifestyle and that sort of thing. But is it nature or nurture? If it's nurture, you'd expect adoptive parents and adopted children to be just as similar in weight. Mm-hmm. In fact, they correlate 0.00. They correlate not at all. And then could it really be all nature? Well, what about the correlation between those adopted away kids and their birth parents? 0.4. They correlate just as much as parents who share genes and environment. So the neat thing is that the adoption data and the twin data give you similar results, suggesting that everything is heritable to some extent. Nothing is 100% heritable, sure, which provides good evidence for the importance of environment. And then to have the DNA revolution come along and also find some of the genes that account for some of the heritability of these traits. So that's a long-winded explanation.
No, that's great. It's very good to explain a lot of the what's going on with these studies. So let's talk a little bit about specific areas here for a bit. Okay. In terms of genes and heritability, what do we know about, cognitive abilities? So, when I'm, doing psych evaluations and I'm giving people, intelligence tests and, measuring their cognitive abilities, and we're looking at verbal abilities, nonverbal abilities, visual, spatial, fluid reasoning, working memory, processing speed, all these wonderful things. You look at all these other components. And you get I'm kind of saying this from my world, but you get a list of scores and you get domains and you get all the data, right? And you write things or whatever. If people understand or just know what their cognitive abilities are, loosely, right? Which is, I should just make the distinction here. There's overlap, but there is a distinction between cognitive abilities and achievement abilities. That they're different. There's overlap, but there is difference. How much can we say for any given individual? As you said, obviously there is cognitive abilities are heritable, but how do we know what is the boundaries of that or the limits of that with a person? And then what does that look like when compared with other types of people as well? When we look at norm differences or normative strengths and weaknesses, what do you know about cognitive abilities and the heritability there for people?
Well, cognitive abilities, as I said, the first twin studies a century ago looked at cognitive abilities. That's about when Spearman these first tests, the Stanford Binet, they were all developed in the early 1900s, and they found evidence for substantial genetic influence in rather small twin studies. But a lot of that research was shut down in the 30s, 40s with behaviorism and eugenics. But when it started coming back in the 50s and 60s, there was a famous paper in 1980, I think it was, in Science, that put together all the family, twin, and adoption studies at the time, of general cognitive ability, intelligence, and came up with data that looked like about 50% heritability for these. And subsequently, cognitive ability has been studied as much as about any other traits. And there's, in addition to confirming substantial genetic influence, I'd say on average, we're talking about 60% heritability for general cognitive ability. And then you mentioned verbal and nonverbal, and they also are heritable. But what's interesting is that you can look at not just the heritability, but the genetic correlation between traits. And people since Spearman in 1904 have talked about G, general cognitive ability.
Yes.
And what he was talking about is the empirical fact that very different cognitive measures like memory or spatial or verbal all correlate at some level of 0.3 or 0.4. And that's what he meant by G. It's just, you can, using factor analysis, you can abstract statistically weightings that give you that general score. And that's what IQ tests are, really. I mean, like Wechsler tests are 10 sort of subscales, and basically you add them up with unit weights. You can do a little better by adding them up with factor weights, because some of those tests load better on, more strongly on this general factor. So that's kind of surprising in itself, that there is this general cognitive ability that explains maybe 30, 40% of the variance of all these diverse cognitive measures. But genetics has confirmed that that is substantially genetic in origin. So the genetic correlations among these tests are even stronger. The average genetic correlation among these tests is about 0.6. So the genetic research vindicates that kind of a more ideological level, the idea of G. And there's a lot of interest in, well, what does that involve? Well, we're talking about thousands and thousands of genetic effects. So it's not like you're going to trace some simple neural pathway in the brain. But it does make sense to me if there are thousands of genes involved and all the brain is just as pleiotropic, that is influenced by many genes as behavior, then it kind of makes sense that there's going to be some general overlap in genetic influence related to cognitive abilities. And people find that a little hard to accept because they say, well, I'm good at math, I'm not so good at verbal stuff, or et cetera. But actually, if you're good at verbal, you're probably good at a lot of other things to some extent. On average, you certainly are. So you asked, what do we know about cognitive abilities? And I think the answer is we know a lot. A paper that just came out in Psych Review that I wrote with a student of mine is on this idea of shared environment, because cognitive abilities are an exception to the rule of non-shared environment. For psychopathology and personality, there's just no evidence for shared family environmental influence. But there is for cognitive abilities and educational achievement, but only while children are in their home. As they leave their homes, their families, and make their own way in the world, this shared environmental influence drops out to negligible levels, with one exception, and that is educational attainment, which is years of schooling. And what we say in our paper, the reason for that is that's really a function of decisions made in adolescence. Whether you take these post-secondary school, we call them A-levels for 2 years, and then if you make the decision to apply to university, that's a lot to do with family influence, I think. So there is some, maybe 20% shared environmental influence on that. But what interests me is that in the long run, even for cognitive abilities later in life, which is when they matter for occupational success and that sort of thing, there's no shared environmental influence. The environmental influences are non-shared. That is, they make two kids in the same family as different as kids from different families. So no one has studied that. Everyone's kind of assumed that the environmental influences on cognitive abilities are these family influences. And that's true up through adolescence. But later in life, there's no evidence for that. So what on earth is causing environmental effects on cognitive abilities later in life? And I think it's the same real but random sort of idea.
Yes, that's very interesting. Tell us about, so I was curious about this. So we can do these two together, I guess. What are the personalities? It's so hard to kind of nail down. It's hard to nail down. No one agrees on a definition, and so personality is tough, but it's hard to measure. I usually lean in terms of there's ways to measure psychopathology, which is one thing we can talk about, of course. But in terms of measuring what personality is, Big Five has been replicated pretty well cross-culturally, et cetera, et cetera. So I usually lean on that. It's not the only thing out there, but in terms of what does the heritability look like with personality? Whether and then just because you're mentioning with the environment here, it's a tough thing. It's such a kind of amorphous kind of construct that we all kind of know, but it's hard to kind of really kind of quantify. I mean, we try, we do our best, but it is sticky sometimes. I mean, so what are your thoughts on personality, I guess, with heritability?
Well, I started out studying personality. For my PhD, I had actually started with animal research because I found it much more powerful. But I was working with mice back in the days before health and safety, and I worked as a graduate student in a closet that was unventilated. And about 50% of the people will develop allergies to mice because their dander is a pheromone that many people become allergic to. And so I had to switch from mice. Otherwise, I'd have to wear an oxygen mask when I was working with them. Wow. And so I decided to study personality, but I wanted to study it developmentally in kids because all of the data, and there's, as you say, a substantial amount of data on twin studies, adoption studies of personality, but they're all self-report. Yeah. And, self-report is not nothing, because how you view yourself in terms of the big five, it correlates. It's quite stable over life, but that's sort of your belief about yourself. Right. But there are studies, if we ask two of your best friends about these personality traits, they'd agree maybe 0.3, not terrifically well. There'd be some agreement, whether you're active or emotional, et cetera, sociable. But I wanted to study kids because kids, young kids can't do self-report. So you have to come up with other ways of measuring it. And so I use parent reports. I believe in teacher reports because teachers see a lot. Parents aren't so great because they only see their kids,
Yes, yes.
But teachers see a lot of kids. And if they say this kid's hyperactive, I think that's a better indicator. We also did objective studies, videotaped observations, reactions to toys like these Bobo dolls. I don't know if they have them anymore. They have sand in the bottom. You can knock them over. Yeah. Amazing to see. Kids go, some kids go berserk with those things, beat the shit out of it. Yes, we lost a lot of Bobo dolls during that thing. So there are other ways of doing it. And what you generally find, though, I kind of thought if we had these more objective measures, we might get more specificity. Because one of the things you find hard to accept in personality self-report is everything is heritable. And everything's pretty much equally heritable. Even things that, like femininity. Well, which you can measure in males and females. And you think, okay, now that must be more cultural. It must be less heritable. But it's not that much less heritable than the big five, emotionality and activity and neuroticism. So, but at the end of the day, when we studied these objective measures, same sort of thing. I mean, everything we could study seemed to show some genetic influence. And but in the end, it's very difficult to measure personality, because even these objective situations, you can do it with kids, but, attempts to do that with adults, you put them in a room with a stooge and the stooge is acting weirdly and you look at how they interact. Or virtual reality, you can do some cool stuff with now. It's like getting typical behavior from you in an atypical situation, like in a lab. The neat thing about cognitive tests is their maximal performance. And people, so I think that makes the big difference is measurement. And that's probably why cognitive abilities and tests of educational achievement as well, why they work better. They're just better measures to some extent. So that's why I switched to cognitive development.
Yeah, I mean, I'm totally in agreement. I will be the first to admit personality is tough. It's a tough thing to measure. The measurement is hard. Self-report measures are fine. I think it's one node of sorts on many, but I always lament their kind of very low ceiling that they have. It is what it is. Okay. On psychopathology, it was great reading, your work on psychopathology. Kind of give us, I guess, your idea, or I shouldn't say your idea, but kind of your research on exploring some of these aspects of, making the claim that many disorders we know don't have I mean, disorders, I mean, for me they're a heuristic. It's a created label of sorts, and that's not to get too meta or, well, what's really this, but, I mean, I've taught psychopathology to grad students now for, 7-8 years now, something like that. And then every semester when I teach it, I'm just like, I mean, I know this stuff, but it's not really real. Like there's, we're trying to get a constellation of symptoms, but even there, even with the DSM for all of its, challenges and issues, I get their, the multidimensionality. They're trying to do different kinds of things here. But you're having somebody that has a certain presentation of something, and we call it this to group all these symptoms and the presentation together. But even within that, it's not completely there. And, the DSM-5 is, making up disorders now just to, in some ways. But yeah, I mean, how do we look at the heritability or the genetic piece for disorders? You kind of have the I guess the outside the box kind of idea on this, when I read it, I was very pleased because I was like, yes, this makes a lot of sense after working with it clinically and teaching, pathology. And I was like, yes, this makes a lot of sense. Just tell us your kind of work on this.
Well, I think my view has been quite extreme, but as I talk to psychiatrists or clinicians who work with patients, I don't think they have much trouble with it. Mm-hmm. So there's two aspects to it. I mean, one is that the genetics suggests that there are no disorders, there are just dimensions. Mm-hmm. And looking at the extreme of a dimension is important. Maybe having a cutoff on a quantitative measure of symptoms, maybe that's good because, you've got to say who are the ones you want to treat or not. But the problem with DSM categorizations is that they reify these things. Yes. Are you schizophrenic or not? Mm-hmm. And there's reasons for that, insurance, social services sort of things. But it's really, I think, what's holding us back in psychopathology research more than anything, the idea that there are these categories and they're qualitative. Whereas all the genetic data, like the polygenic scores for schizophrenia and bipolar are the better, and hyperactivity are the best predicted by DNA. Mm-hmm, but these polygenic scores are absolutely normally distributed. Mm-hmm. There are no genes specific to bipolar or ADHD. We're just talking about quantitative issues rather than qualitative. Mm-hmm. So it's a matter of more or less rather than either or. Mm-hmm. And that's really kind of revolutionary in a way because, it suggests I have a paper in 2009 called Common Disorders Are Quantitative Traits, or Quantitative Dimensions. Mm-hmm. And I thought I'd get a lot of irritated psychiatrists, but you can't deal with people in a clinical setting and put them in these boxes because it's much more complicated than that. It might help you get an idea of what's going on. But, as you said at first, what are these constellations of symptoms that people put together? And I think a big problem is that almost all of them are historical rather than empirical. The worst example is autism. Yep. Who says autism has these 3 components, or now with DSM-5, 2 components? Right. And it's Kanner, 1945, because he found kids who, they had social and communication problems. And it's true, if you have 1 problem, that's bad. If you have 2 problems, that's worse. If you have 3 problems, that's worse yet. And you'll find kids just by the bivariate normal distribution, kids with this problem can also have that problem, and they're worse off. But that doesn't make it a constellation. It doesn't make it a syndrome. Mm-hmm. It just means that by chance these kids go together. What you want to know about is the etiological connection between them. And so autism does seem to be highly heritable in twin studies and adoption studies, but the DNA studies have had trouble finding genes for what we call autism. And we did a twin study that looked at the genetic connection between the DSM-4 at that time, 3 components of autism. And they're less genetically correlated than major psychiatric disorders are. Schizophrenia and bipolar are genetically correlated 0.6. Right. And this hit people between the eyes when they did the first GWAS studies and found the first study was on bipolar, and then they did a study of schizophrenia, which, as you know from DSM-5, it's the first diagnostic in the nosology of diagnoses. It's the first distinction you make. Up until DSM, I think 5, you couldn't be schizophrenic and bipolar because they're different. And yet, when they did the GWAS of schizophrenia, the top hits were all the same as for bipolar. And then we went on to be able to use DNA data to get at genetic correlations. And we find schizophrenia and bipolar correlate genetically 0.6. Means most of the genes for schizophrenia are going to be genes for bipolar. And yet for autism, the components of autism, the genetic correlation may be 0.3. So it's just bizarre. So it kind of leaves me like Alice in Wonderland. First of all, there aren't disorders, there are dimensions. But second, this classification scheme we have has very little relationship to the genetic architecture. And that's bad. So I think we need to do something very different, and there are approaches, like approaches that are going bottom up empirically from symptoms to see what hangs together, which is the way cognitive developed. It was built up empirically. So I think the top-down sort of psychopathology by committee, approach, it really ought to be dead by now.
I 110% agree with everything you just said. It feels the way it's done now, this by committee, it just feels like an artifact. The DSM-1 and 2 is a bunch of Freudians, making stuff together and all that stuff, which is fine. I mean, we got another history, and they were trying, and it was the first attempt to kind of classify something that, so I'm not going to throw shade at, the first two DSM. DSM-3 in 1980 was the first kind of modernization of how we know it now. But it just feels way too political. It feels way too top down, and I just don't think it's accurate. And especially again, something that's been going on for a long time is 5-10 years is now people. I think people are slowly realizing this, and for the public, I understand this, but the turn isn't to be against psychiatry and it's all, a bunch of bullshit and, this doesn't work and all these things. That's not the turn. Or elites are terrible, or, academics don't know anything, or just, that's not the turn. The turn has to be, we're overdiagnosing autism, and not everybody that is socially awkward is autistic, right? They're not an individual with autism. Okay, but what that's saying is it's the same thing with anxiety. You can have anxiety. There's nothing wrong with having anxiety, and you could have anxiety in a more clinical or pathological way, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have a disorder. And the real problem with this is people will be suffering, or they will have challenges, and everyone's got different resiliency, things like that. But they can't get any treatment if they don't have a label, which, oftentimes, unless you're paying out of pocket, all these things. And then this is where this stuff has real, kind of going back to our point about preventative care and proactive things. If you're socially awkward, yes, you might not be, have autism, but it doesn't mean that you're not having a tough time trying to interact with other people. Yeah. And you shouldn't be overdiagnosed or diagnosed with a label that's not accurate. But you also should not be able to not get treatment. So it's just, the whole thing is so frustrating.
Yeah. Well, two things I would like to say about that. First is I'd like to emphasize what you were implying there, that I'm not saying there aren't problems. People have problems. I'm just saying, what's the advantage, scientifically at least, of pretending that there are these ideologically distinct disorders that you either have or don't have? And I don't see it. But the other thing I would say about that is I had a friend a few months ago, a middle-aged man, who called me up and was so excited because he said he's found out what's been his whole problem in life. He's just been diagnosed as ADHD.
I hear this all the time.
Yeah, and you go, oh my God. I didn't have the heart to tell him because he was so relieved, but I didn't have the heart to tell him. It doesn't mean a damn thing.
Yes. Yes. Well, but this is a problem with. I think it's too over medicalized still, where it's like people want it like, oh, I have strep throat. Oh, I have the flu. Oh, I have. It's a thing to be like, oh, I know what it is. We treat it. Done. Unfortunately, psychopathology doesn't work that way most of the time, right? And even if you legitimately have ADHD, and yes, stimulants work great, but it's not because of the label. It's because you're treating symptoms.
I think with ADHD, though, it's even different. Those of us who grew up in the 60s and 70s, we know that speed makes you get tunnel vision. And there was an NIMH study that showed that normal kids will also respond in a similar way. It gives you tunnel vision, so even that isn't, that medicalization, in developmental disorders, the best way to do it is you give it it used to be hyperkinesis. You don't have problems learning to read. You've got dyslexia. You don't have problems with math. It's dyscalculia, which gives it that, more of a medicalization, if you can give it some Greek or Latin name, for example. And as you say, it's because people think we're thinking the whole medical model, I think, is what's holding us back. Because that's the idea that, if you get cholera, you go and you find out, well, what's causing that cholera? You find the cause, the single cause, and then you clean up the water and all done, Yep. And the problem is that with complex traits and common disorders, we're not talking about simple causes, single causes, single gene causes, or single environmental causes, which was what Freud thought about. Mm-hmm. So it's a different ballgame. But I want to emphasize, it's not to say there aren't problems, but to ask what's to be gained by pretending that these are ideologically distinct disorders. And I think the answer is nothing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I totally agree. So last question here. We've covered lots of things: genetics and polygenetic index scores and GWAS and twin studies and heritability. And I guess one thing I want to ask is in the next 10 to let's say 25 years, what is the genetics revolution going to do for us practically, scientifically, for understanding what it means to be human and how to improve our quality of life? What is your optimism and your and the real important need for understanding genetics for understanding all different facets of humanity?
Well, I think it's pretty much what I said before about prevention of problems, and it's part of understanding who we are, I think, as well. And I do think parents will increasingly, first of all, the medical establishment will look at genetic risk indicators and work out ways to prevent problems from occurring to a greater extent. We need bigger and better studies so we get more powerful polygenic score predictors. But I'm optimistic that it's going to finish the transition from environmentalism to genetics by making it very concrete that you can use polygenic scores to make these predictions. So it's not just this abstract results of twin and adoption studies. And I do think increasingly in society and education, genetics will be taken more seriously. One thing we haven't talked about that is another big finding on the environment that is relevant here, and that is what I call the nature of nurture, genetic influence on environmental measures. Mm-hmm. Because that was an amazing finding in the 80s, that the environmental measures we use in psychology show genetic influence. Mm-hmm. And that's, again, learning about the environment because we take genetics seriously. Mm. And so what this is about is that in psychology, what we call environmental measures like life events or social support or parenting, they're not the environment out there independent of us. Mm. Like there's not an experimenter out there shocking us if we do something right or wrong. The environments we study in psychology are our experiences. They're how we interact with our environment. Mm. And that's where the genetics comes in. Mm. So, even drive this point home, in the 80s, I did a study on genetic influence on television viewing in children, because television viewing has been used as an environmental measure in thousands of studies, but no one said, well, is it completely environmental? And, as a parent, I know it's not. Kids differ in how much they want to watch television. And you'd think parents control how much kids watch television, but they don't do it as much as they think. And so we found that there was genetic influence on television viewing. And the one that shocked people later was divorce. There's genetic influence on divorce. Again, divorce isn't what happens to you. I've been divorced 3 times, so I know it has something to do with me. It's a relationship. It's how relationships start and end, and it's not the environment out there. So the reason that's important is because the book Blueprint, probably the 3 main findings is that everything is heritable to some extent. The environment's important, but the way it seems to work is not as we thought it did, as shared environment, but as non-shared environment, which I think is probably random, idiosyncratic, unpredictable. And the third finding is what looks like environmental influence, like correlations between parenting and children's outcome, is substantially genetics in disguise. It's really, you can't say, because drives me nuts, looking in the media where you see forever they're trying to scare parents by saying, okay, well, parents do this, the kids are like that. And what I would like people listening to this always to say, yeah, but what about genetics? So parents who read a lot to their kids have kids who do better in reading when they go to school. Reasonable to think that that's environmental, but you got to ask, what about genetics? And it turns out there's strong genetic influence on that. Parents who like to read and have books in their home have kids who are genetically better disposed to learn to read and to like to read.
Is this the whole thing of the active, passive, evocative
Gene
kind
environment
of gene environment correlation? Yeah.
Exactly,
this is kind of what
right.
you're describing. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly right. So just briefly on that, the passive is the idea that kids inherit both genes and environment passively from their parents. But more important probably are reactive, where people react to a child based on their genetic propensities. So you notice a kid who's just really good at singing, and maybe you give them more opportunities. But most important of all, I think, is active, and it's the least studied. Genetics doesn't just do its thing, in a hardwired sense. Kids, the most strongly heritable cognitive measure is vocabulary, which often shocks people because they say, well, wait, you got to learn vocabulary. But I hope listening to this, you realize some kids are predisposed to like to tune in to the verbal channel. I have one grandchild who always wants to ask about nuances of words, and then some of the other grandchildren, whatever, what I mean. They don't care about vocabulary. And so the girl is going to develop a lot better vocabulary, but it's because she's actively using the environment to foster her genetic propensities. And I think that to a large extent is how genetics works. And it reminds me to just say that I think appetites are just as important as aptitudes. It's like you just like the verbal channel. You like to learn nuances of words. So there's a lot to unpack there. But the reason I wanted to raise this issue of the nature of nurture, that is genetic influence on environmental measures, because that's what the book is about. The reason the title is Blueprint, How DNA Makes Us Who We Are, is this idea that DNA is the major systematic force making us who we are. The environment's important, but it largely operates at this non-shared, idiosyncratic, unpredictable sort of level, and what looks like environmental influences are often genetic influences in disguise.
This is my question here. Would you say that for most traits, genes are seeking out these social environments, or they're altering certain social environments where there's this kind of interplay there? Is that fair to say? Or
well, I think that the for cognition especially, it has a lot to do with how you use your environment. It isn't like this passive thing of it's not instruction, what the teachers shove in your head. It's from the Latin educare, which is to lead out. You can't help it as a teacher. You see some kids, all you got to do is stay out of their way, and they're going to learn this stuff, especially with the internet now. Whereas other kids are going to need a lot more help. So I do think the idea of GE correlation is important.
Yeah. It's all great stuff. I mean, I've loved your work for a long time. Your book is great, Blueprint. People should get it. Robert, this is so much fun, such a real treat. I really enjoyed you sharing all of your work and your research and giving us your wisdom and time and energy. So big thanks for coming on and sharing all that with us.
Well, thank you very much for having me on, and best of luck for your podcast series. I think it's great. Converging dialogues, isn't it?
Yes.
Converging dialogues.
Yes,
So
thank you.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
All right.